Well, this is Freedom Express, and this is the series Quest for Freedom. And in this episode, we will talk about the historical journey of India from medieval period to colonial period. We have legendary historian from JNU, Professor Harbans Mukhia. He is an expert on this period of history, and we shall learn about the agriculture, industry, education, social relations, and politics of this period. Today is going to talk to us about the medieval India. Professor Mukhia.
Hello friends, in the two lectures that I've been asked to give you, I'll be speaking to you on the transition of medieval India into colonial India. How did we get this term medieval for India? Colonial, we understand, we were colonized by Britain, so we became a colony, and therefore there is a colonial period. But medieval, where did we land with this term medieval? The term, the tripartite division of history into ancient, medieval, and modern, with which we are so familiar, this was actually a European invention sometime in the 17th century, starting earlier, but towards the end of the 17th century, they divided history into these three periods. They divided history into these three periods from the point of view of their present. Their present in the 17th century was a period of what they called modernity. It was a modern period. A modern period was one which, according to them, was characterized by rationality, reason, and later on science, technology, progress, etc., etc. When they created this self-image of modernity for Europe, they also created an image which was its other, which was its opposite, which was also for Europe, namely medieval, also ancient, but medieval is the important one here. If modern is an age of reason, rationality, progress, etc., etc., medieval is its opposite. Medieval is the period of what they call dark ages of irrationality, superstition, religion, religiosity, and so on and so forth. And of course, stagnation and backwardness. So medieval was just what was not modern. This was they thought was true of their medieval past, or what they considered medieval past, up to the 16th century, starting anywhere between 5th, 6th century AD to about 16th century AD, or slightly earlier, slightly later, 14th century really, but extendable to what they begin to call early modern period. Now, this medieval period of dark ages is the image that they created for themselves, in contrast to modern. Now, this tripartite division of ancient, medieval, and modern was transferred to the rest of the world as Europe expanded itself to the rest of the world through conquest, first through trade and through arms, and then through conquest and politics and so on. As they expanded into the rest of the world, they not only brought trade and arms and so on, they also brought their concepts into these regions. And therefore, the whole of the world began to think in terms of ancient, medieval, and modern towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. In India, for example, this tripartite division is used for the first time in 1903 by British historian Stanley Lanepool. Prior to that, the tripartite division of ancient, medieval, modern had another nomenclature which was brought to India by James Mill, a classic colonial historian, imperialist historian, James Mill. His book, published in 1817, A History of British India, brought this tripartite division in, excuse me, uh, in with a different nomenclature, namely the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British period. Uh, his idea was that just as medieval Europe was the age of darkness for it, age of religiosity and superstition and so on and so forth, medieval India was also an age of darkness for it when the Muslims ruled here. So his nomenclature of ancient, medieval, and modern changed its terminology and became Hindu, Muslim, and British period. And his assumption was that prior to the British colonial period, he didn't call it colonial. He just called it British period. India was ruled entirely. India had no other sensibility, no other consideration, no other principle of governance except religiosity, religion, and religiosity. He was dead set against religions. He was very contemptuous of Islam, but he was even more contemptuous of Hinduism, and therefore he thought it is British colonialism which brought civilization to India and progress, and unshackled it and brought progress and so on. So the term medieval comes to us from the outside. It's not an indigenous term, and it was held equivalent to Muslim period. Muslim and medieval became coterminous in the Indian context, thanks to James Mill. Now, as I said, medieval period, whether in Europe or in India, was known to be supposed to be characterized by irrationality and superstition, and of course stagnation of various kind. Economics, technological and economic stagnation for sure, but also cultural and so on. So that medieval is equivalent to stagnation of every kind. We still use this term medieval often, in the his mind is so and so, he beats his wife, he's so medieval in his outlook. So we use the term medieval almost always in the sense of, in a derogatory sense, in the sense of something which is irrational, which is what Europe has taught us to do. Anyway, so it was equivalent to stagnation, irrationality and stagnation of every kind. Let's see whether medieval India, the so-called medieval India, was really a period of stagnation of every kind. Let's look at different aspects of this notion of stagnation. Economic aspect, to begin with, economic aspect. As far as we can go, we have evidence of constant agricultural expansion in Indian history. There was a time when it was assumed that expansion came in spurts now and then, but actually by now it is clear that agriculture was expanding throughout Indian history, and particularly so in medieval Indian history. There are new technologies which are being discovered and invented and adopted. Technologies of irrigation, for example, various kinds of water wheels, riot. There are three kinds of water wheels that we experimented with the different regions. Some of these, the last one, they're called Persian wheel in English, or riot, or arhat in our language. This was something that I had seen in my childhood, probably still there somewhere here and there one can see. This is a well which a garland of buckets which is moved by a bullock or two through gearing, etc. This was the last of these three kinds of water wheels, but it was also most effective in a way. So that you have various kinds of water wheels which extend irrigation, and extension of irrigation means extension of agriculture. There were other technologies, some of which we are quite familiar with. Uh, Oil press, for example. We still call it, don't we call it kachi ghani ka tel? Uh, Oil press or cotton press. Cotton seeds are thrown out of the cotton by this press, and so on. All of these technologies are developed in the early medieval period, sometime around 7th, 8th century onwards to about 12th, 13th century. So that the technologies which were developed now were used until the 20th century, certainly until the end of the or large part of the 20th century. So powerful were these technologies, and which extended agriculture as well, as I said. There is also a growing monetization of the economy in the medieval period for various reasons. One, production is growing and therefore trade begins to pick up. Two, that the state is now collecting its revenue from the peasants in cash rather than in kind. Kind also, but they are trying to introduce cash in place of kind as far as possible. So a growing monetization of the economy is taking place. Market is therefore expanding with expansion of economy. Monetization, growing monetization. The medieval India is becoming, a great sort of receptacle of bullion from all over the world. It was becoming a kind of capital of major source of production of textiles, and textiles, mind you, is the biggest industry prior to industrialization. And European nations countries were fighting with each other to come to India and buy textiles, and in exchange for bullion, buy textiles and indigo and spices and so on and so forth. So that it's an economy which is growing all the time. So much so that by the early 18th century, India was the richest country in the world, so much so that it commanded something like 25% of the world's GDP. A quarter of the whole world's wealth was produced and was under the control of India early in the 18th century. When the Mughal Empire began to decline, India was the richest country in the world. India and China together, they commanded nearly 50% of the GDP of the world. India having an equal share in that. So that it's not an economy which is stagnating. It's an economy which is growing very, 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 very impressively throughout these centuries. And all the European travelers who come to India, they remark on the richness of India, the wealth of India. They're dumbstruck when they see the wealth of India in all its sort of glory and so on. So that it's far from a stagnant economy. It's an economy which is growing very, very fast, very, very impressively throughout the medieval period. Early on also, but throughout the medieval period, right up to the early 18th century. That's economy. Culture. Was there cultural stagnation in the medieval period? The term Mughal is an equivalent of cultural grandeur. Whenever we want to describe somebody as grand, or some venture as grand, we call it Mughal. So and so is the media Mughal. Rupert Murdoch is the media Mughal. So and so is the is the movie Mughal. So Mughal is a term of grandeur, cultural grandeur, and it's not a term which is confined now to India or to the Persian language or Urdu language. It's a term used everywhere. Everywhere the term Mughal, around the world, the term Mughal signifies grandeur. Why? How did this term acquire such significance as to be equivalent of grandeur? Because you see the grandeur around, which still survives. Architectural grandeur. Taj Mahal is only one of them, the most grand of them, but there are so many others. The Humayun's tomb, the various mosques that are built, the forts that are built, the Red Forts of Agra and Delhi. And mind you, the Red Fort of Delhi's significance is evident from the fact that right from 15th August 1947, the Prime Minister of independent India, irrespective of who or she is, irrespective of which party he or she belongs to, the Prime Minister of independent India in the 20th and 21st century gives his or her Independence Day lecture from the medieval fort, Red Fort, built by Shah Jahan. So that there is obviously some symbolic significance of that Red Fort that you can't think of, no Prime Minister can think of giving the lecture, Independence Day lecture from anywhere else except the Red Fort. So that the grandeur, and then in paintings, music, dance, in literature, languages, food, dress, in every kind of sphere of life, culture and life and culture. The medieval contribution, in fact, medieval contribution is immense. In fact, the languages that we speak, unfortunately, I'm having to speak in the language that doesn't belong to medieval India, but the languages that we otherwise speak, all the regional languages except for South Indian, Dravidian languages, all the other languages from Gujarati, Marathi to Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi, and so on and so forth, all of these languages developed in the medieval period from what around 1100 AD onwards. These are all contributions of medieval period. So that there is a great deal of cultural grandeur in every sphere. There is also a high degree of urbanization in the medieval period. Something like 15% of India was urbanized, had urban centers. There is a historian of Akbar's time, Nizamuddin Ahmad Bakshi. He writes that he says that he wants to write, before he dies, he wants to write a history of 4,000 cities and towns in India. So he counts roughly 4,000. He mentions 4,000, which is a rough count, but his estimate is that there are 4,000 cities and towns in India in the 16th century. So you can imagine what the level of urbanization in medieval India that had occurred, which is still in the process of occurring everywhere, but also more so in India. So that it's a culturally, and in terms of social life, and in terms of daily needs, and accoutrements of daily needs, it was a very, very dynamic period, culturally very, very dynamic period. Socially, it's very interesting that the medieval rulers, they came and conquered and settled down here naturally, unlike the British, who the British rule is called the colonial period because they came and conquered but didn't settle down here. They they collected wealth from here, and unlike the medieval Indian rulers, they also collected wealth from the farmers in the form of revenue, kharaj, and so on and so forth. But it was all invested here. They didn't take it away anywhere. They never went away anyway. None of them ever went away anyway. And in any case, apart from among the Mughal rulers, apart from Babur and Humayun, all the other rulers were born here and brought up here and died here, and so also the earlier rulers. So that the medieval Indian rule is not a colonial rule in the sense in which British rule is colonial rule, in which a people of one country go and conquer another country, rule over it, but withdraw its wealth, drain its wealth for their own country, for their mother country, as Britain did. Drain of wealth, as it came to be called, drain of wealth from India to Britain. That's how Britain became rich and industrialized and so on, but that's another story. So that the medieval Indian rulers came and conquered and established their rule and administration and so on and so forth, which was a great mix of, underneath them, the entire administration was being carried out by the old administrative system, particularly of zamindars, etc. I'll come to in a moment. But they established their rule over it, but they did not disturb the social system. They did not concern themselves with the caste system of the Hindus, which is so crucial to the organization of the Hindu community. They never even bothered about it. The only interference they did was in the social and cultural norms of mores of Hindus. Was Akbar had prohibited the sati. Sati still went on, but he had prohibited it, and there are some cases where this prohibition was effected. But that's about the only. They did not interfere with the. They did not interfere with the cultural, religious norms of the Hindus, cultural norms of the Hindus, their civil laws, how they got married, how they inherited property, etc. That remained according to the Hindu codes. And so that they did not impose the Shariat over the entire population. Shariat was imposed only for the Muslim population. So that they did not interfere with the structure of Hindu community and Hindu society. This is in contrast to the British rule, which actively interfered, which greatly studied every detail of Hindu community and its laws and its culture and its languages and so on and so forth, and interfered with them, which also led to a great deal of resistance. But the medieval Indian rulers had nothing to do. They didn't interfere very much. They let the society be as it was. However, at the social level, there is a great deal of innovation of ideas. Some of the ideas are fascinating, which still live with us. And the ideas are, for the most fascinating idea is that, when Islam comes to India, it's a completely different religion. The concept of God is different. The norms of worship of gods are different. The forms of worship of God are different, and so on and so forth. Everything is different. And therefore, there was bound to be both a bit of accommodation and a bit of tension between them. Naturally, when two opposite forms of religion or religiosity or any other social forms, social norms come into contact with each other, everywhere there is both a bit of give and take and a bit of tension between them. So there was tension between them. What does one do to resolve this tension? There is a fantastic, absolutely breathtaking innovation of a resolution of this, and namely that, in Islam, God is Allah. There is only one God, La ilaha illallah. There is only one God. There are no other gods. In Hinduism, there are thousands and millions of gods, gods and goddesses, and so on and so forth. And the God of God Allah and God Ishwar, they are not only alternatives to each other, but they are competing with each other. They are competing gods. They are rivals to each other. They are competing gods, and therefore their followers are also competing with one another in the performance of their rituals and worship and so on and so forth. And in at social level, they are competing. They are rivals to each other. Now. Christianity also had seen, medieval Christianity had also seen lots and lots of not only tension but great bloodshed among the Christians themselves, the Catholics and the Protestants and so on. We know the history of that bloodshed. But in India, interestingly, a new concept was developed at the ground level by the Bhakti saints, particularly by Kabir. The concept was of one universal God. Not two gods. ये दो भगवान कहाँ से आयो, says Kabir. दो भगवान कहाँ से आ गए? There is only one God for us all. So there are no rival gods now. There is only one universal God and one universal religiosity, which is a fantastic conceptualization of or resolution of this tension, because, and you can see that in the 500 odd years, 550 odd years of the so-called Muslim rule, which historians don't use this term, James Mill's terms, Muslim period and Muslim rule. But anyway, the so-called Muslim rule, there is not a single communal riot. The first communal riot that takes place is in 1714 in Ahmedabad, 7 years after Aurangzeb's death. There's a lot of tension otherwise, various kinds of tensions between the rulers, Mughal rulers and aspirants to new political forces that are emerging, Marathas and Jats and Sikhs and Awadh and so on, Nizam and so on. New tensions are arising, but often even bloodshed. But at the social level, there are no communal riots. The first communal riot, as I said, is in 1714, 7 years after Aurangzeb's death. There is no evidence of communal riot, and that is because the communal tensions were resolved by the conceptualization of one universal God instead of rival gods. As Kabir said, "Do Jagdish kahan se aayo?" We don't need two gods. Administratively, a very high degree of centralized control was established over a vast part of India. Not the whole of India, but gradually a vast part of India. A centralized control, administrative control was established, which is very good for good administration, uniformity of administrative rules, uniformity or large degree of uniformity of administrative practices, and so on and so forth. So that now this administration was run at the top level by Jagirdars and the lower level by Zamindars. The Jagirdars were, not all of them were Muslims, mostly they were Muslims, but the Zamindars were, almost all of them were Hindus. And the Jagirdars were people appointed by the state to administer this region or that region, and they were constantly transferable. The Zamindars were the ones who were permanent. They were not transferable because they were not government employees. They were there before the Muslim state was established, and they outlasted the Muslim state. So that at the administrative level, a kind of ruling an administrative system which was run efficiently by a machinery which composed of Muslims and Hindus and through their cooperation, also with tension between them, but through their cooperation, it was run for about 500 to 600 years very efficiently. That's how India became so rich and powerful in the beginning of the 18th century. So, after all this, does this medieval period look like a stagnant period to you, economically, culturally, administratively? It looks to me like a very, very fast moving period rather than a stagnant period. We'll come to in the next lecture, we'll see how things changed in the 18th century. Thank you.
It has been a very fascinating experience listening to Professor Mukhia, carrying the historical journey over the last several hundred years prior to the arrival of British in India. We have seen India was a dynamic society, not at the bottom of world economy, but rather at the top. We have also seen that there were fusion of cultures in India, very divergent religious philosophies like monotheism and polytheism. They converged through the efforts of saints like Kabir, and Indian society did not see a religious violence prior to 1714. And I think this is a great attribute to India, that Indian society has evolved the culture of living together. Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Mukhia.